I am fantasy and romance author Leslie Penelope, and this is Imagining Success, an interview series where I speak to authors who have achieved career milestones that others only dream about, and ask them how they got there and where they go from here. Today, I speak with New York Times bestselling author Daniel José Older. Daniel has been nominated for the Kirkus Prize, the World Fantasy Award, the Locus, and the Mythopoeic Award, among others, and is a winner of the International Latino Book Award. He writes novels for teens and adults, as well as a monthly comic book series, and is a lead story architect for Star Wars: The High Republic. He and his wife, Brittany N also have a podcast called Inkbottle, where they talk about writing, creativity, and parenting. I've known Daniel since before I started publishing, and watching his career trajectory and success has been incredibly inspiring. We chat about creativity, both in crafting our stories and our careers, and how our work can change lives and potentially, hopefully, change the world. I really hope that you enjoy our conversation. So thank you so much, Daniel José Older, for being on My Imaginary Friends, being part of my Imagining Success series. I'm so happy that you are here.
Very happy to be here. It's such a great idea for a series and such an important conversation. You know, we all need to be having as writers, and we don't have enough.
I agree. I totally agree. That's why I started it. So I wanted to start out by asking you, before you even started publishing, why did you start writing in the first place?
Oh, man. I feel it's like, you know, those choices that don't feel like a choice. It never felt like a choice. I don't feel like I chose writing. I did, but I don't feel like I did. It felt like writing chose me. Like, that's what it felt like. Because if I don't write, I will explode. You know, like it's just like a necessity. What I did choose very consciously and eventually, and after lots of trial and error, was that it was going to be books. And by that, I mean, like for many years, you know, I was just bouncing around a lot, different mediums. Like, even if we just start after, because, you know, I went to a liberal arts school, so that's like natural. You should be trying lots of different things. But even after college, like, I thought it would be music for a long time. So for most of my 20s, my main artistic focus was music and paying my rent, which was what I did on the ambulance, you know. So I was working full time. I was trying to make music happen, largely, I don't want to say not successfully, but I wasn't getting to a point where I could see like a future where I would get paid for real doing it. So there's practical levels to it. And even during that time, I was like, what if I try some screenplays? What if I try some poetry, you know, essays? Not getting published, just like writing stuff and like throwing it into voids or like leaving it on my desktop. I was like submitting, but it was just like somewhere in there, I got really tired of trying to get like band members to show up places, and even more tired of trying to get audiences to show up places, because that was a drag. And and then even when it wasn't that, it was like trying to organize, you know, production and all that stuff. I was like, none of this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to tell stories. Like, stories are what is really at the heart of it. For me, I love storytelling, and that revelation led me to be like, if I just sit down with a computer, I could just write a book, and that would be so much easier than dealing with trumpet players. Like, trumpet players, but I don't know, like it takes a lot for someone to be like, it would be so easy to just write a book. But literally, it is a lot easier. At least it's just me and the laptop. You know what I mean? So it felt like this huge relief to just be like, and writing has just always been a true expression like that I feel familiar and friendly with. Since I was a teenager, I was journaling. And so it felt very natural to just sit down and like write.
Yeah. I mean, my undergrad is in film. So like when you're trying to wrangle people to make a whole film, yes, at that point, writing a book by yourself is so much easier than dealing with other people and their creativity. You know, now a band is probably even more collaborative, but films are very collaborative too. So
I love the creativity aspect of it. It's the scheduling aspect of it. Like,
yes.
And it's ironic because now I write for comics, so I'm back in the team mode, and I love it so much. Feels like such a relief after novels where you're just kind of in your own zone. But now it's like, you know, instead of writing a whole page of description, I write one line, and then some guy named Harvey, who's an incredible artist, Harvey Tolibao, who's the main artist I work with, creates this masterpiece from out of this one line that I wrote. And it's amazing, you know, but that's a whole other story.
It's got full circle to the collaborative again. Yeah. So from journaling and writing for yourself, what was the leap from that to publishing for you?
I think the bridge between that was blogging, actually. So, you know, I was working on the ambulance, and I would come home, and I was harboring the deep down desire to be a writer, but the feeling that it wasn't possible somehow. I was undercutting myself, and it's just like, it's even in my 20s, there was a part of me that was like, that's like for old dead white people. You know what I mean? Like that's who writers are. I know that's not true, and I knew then it wasn't true, but there was a subconscious part, I think, that was like, that's not
Mhm.
you. Um, but yeah, so I would come home after like an overnight shift, and I would just be like, "Oh, here's this wild shit that happened," da, 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 and write it down. And I would write it quick, and it would be funny. I basically treated it like I was telling a story to someone next to me,
Mhm.
and that's my favorite kind of writing. Feels intimate in the way that, like, as if you're speaking to someone right there. My personal love, in literature, is when that narrative voice comes through so strong, like a storyteller, like an intimate. And paramedics are excellent storytellers, so we would tell these stories to each other. And that's what I just treated the blog as. I would just be like, look, this is some crazy wild shit that happened, pop pop pop, write it down and post it. And like, the blog didn't take off at all, but the people that read it were like, this is really good. And I was like, I had fun doing it. And then I was like, if I just made some shit up, this would be fiction. And it just clarified something so clear within me that was like, I had this imaginary thing, this like step stool that fiction was on, that like I couldn't get to. Like, it had to be this great American novel or whatever,
Mm,
because then I was like,
mhm.
if I keep writing that fiction, if I do this a lot, it'll be a novel. Like,
Yeah.
and like, it really did break this dam within me where I was just like, there's been a pedestal that's gotten in my way. And once I
Mhm.
got rid of that pedestal, I just started writing short stories, and I used the same voice that I wrote the ambulance stuff in. And then it grew and modified it, and there were ghosts and everything else. And then I started submitting those, and they got rejected and rejected and rejected. And in the meantime, I started writing a novel too. And I'm a Capricorn, so I did it in like 3 months, because I was just like, yeah, like bang. And I sent that out. That got rejected and rejected. That was Shadow Shaper, and that got rejected 40 times. And
Wow.
it took, I think, 3 years before it got accepted, or more. I can't remember. And in the meantime, I was writing more short stories, and slowly the short stories started picking up traction and getting accepted. I think my first publication was literally on someone's Tumblr, where they were like, "Hey, we're just accepting sci-fi or whatever," and I was like, "Would you publish this?" And they were like, "Sure." And two people read it, and like that's like, that's how you start, right? And then
Right?
things just sort of started snowballing. There was a publication that I was actually getting traction from called Cross Genres that eventually put out a collection of my short stories. It's like a small indie press, and that was my first like book. And as that
Mhm.
was happening, someone finally accepted Shadow Shaper, and that same weekend, I finally got an agent, and things really started moving after that.
Oh, wow, yeah, that's, like, kind of simultaneously. So, at that point, when you were thinking what were your goals? What were you thinking success was when you started, shopping Shadow Shaper?
I really, I really thought about it a lot, and I really sat myself down and said, like, what is this going to look like? Like, I wanted to
Mm,
know what I was aiming for, like, very intentionally. Um, and what I came up with then is basically what I still go from now, in that success is that I'm able to write exactly the things that I want to write and survive from it, and like live off.
mm,
And the only thing that's changed is like how much it takes to survive, because I have a toddler, and
right.
but ultimately, like, I'm happy if I'm writing the work I want to write, and
Mm,
not having to, like, you know, write stuff that I don't like, or take all kinds of notes that I don't believe in. At the
mhm,
time going into it too, this was a moment especially where I was like, I didn't know what it was going to be like, but I knew that I wanted to write uh, the truth about the world that I lived in,
mhm,
and not, code it to make white people comfortable, or to make, like, gentrification comfortable, or anything else. Like, these were things I knew I was going to talk about. I was coming from an activist background, and I knew that that was going to be part of my storytelling. So looking at the bookshelf, particularly back then, this was like 2010, 2011, 2012, it was way wider. And it's still super white, but it was even whiter back then, and it wasn't clear that, like, you could publish a book that had characters of color saying honest things, about what those different dynamics were between us, our histories, whiteness, the complexity
mhm,
of that. Like, of course, those books existed, but they were few and far between, and they were hard to find, and they weren't, jumping out of bookshelves into your hands. You had to go find
right.
them. You know what I mean? So, and
Mhm,
especially in genre, like I knew I
mhm,
was going to write fantasy and sci-fi, so it was like, Octavia Butler really was like a lifesaver on so many levels. And then following that light to other lights, which is, I think, how we survive. Tananarive Due, Cherie Renee Thomas, both of them became mentors to me. Nalo Hopkinson, so many amazing writers that were doing stuff at the time, and you really had to like find them, and they changed the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's very similar because I started out self-published because I didn't believe that traditionally published or that the traditional publishers would accept my story about Black people with magic, not ask me to change all kinds of stuff that I didn't want to change. So I definitely feel you. There's a lot of parallels, and things have changed a lot. It'll be 10 years for me next year publishing.
Hey,
Um,
nice. Did
right?
you have
But
a
like,
moment where you were like, okay, wait, no, I'm going to give traditional publishing a shot? Like, what happened that changed that?
what happened was they contacted me. So Monique Patterson at St. Martin's Press saw my self-published books and reached out to me. And that's
Mm,
the only reason why I considered it. Because maybe I would have eventually, at
hmm
that point I had been publishing about a year.
hmm
And, I was just working the self-published, trying to get marketing and get people to know that my books existed.
Yeah,
But I had totally like, I wasn't researching trad pub. I wasn't trying to get an agent. I just wasn't in that world.
totally.
So if a Black woman editor at a major publishing house had not reached out to me, I don't know where I would be now. So
This is why when we were fighting that fight, I mean, we're still fighting that fight, but I just remember having all these conversations with publishers being like, oh, I don't know, or seeing them talk. I don't know. Like, are there people of color out there writing to that degree or whatever? And first of all, that's offensive as all get out.
right?
Second of all, like you have to go look. Like you have to go
Yes.
look. Like these are not the way that the industry is very unfriendly to us. To people of color
Right.
in general, and like to marginalized people as a whole. Like we don't. Why would we think that we could do the work there when y'all aren't putting the work out? There's no
Hmm.
precedent. So now that's changing, but like people in publishing have to be aggressive, and they're allergic to it when it comes to us. And
Yeah.
so they want to drop a diversity banner and like, sing kumbaya, but they don't want to do the real work of like finding the real people who are writing the real stories. That's, that becomes everybody's problem.
And they complain that, oh, we're open, but nobody's coming,
Right,
no one's
right,
submitting.
right,
And
right,
it's like, well,
bro.
what does open mean to you? You know? And I
And they
mean,
have
and there's
resources.
always, yeah, there's a
Yeah.
history of DIY, of us doing it ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I like in film, I had researched Oscar Michaud, who was, early filmmaker back in the day, and even my professor, Haile Grima, people who made their films, basically sold them at the back of their trunk, like Too Short with mixtapes.
Right, right.
That's the culture. So yeah.
Yeah, Steve.
So now, okay, you've gotten published. At some point, you go and get your MFA, right? During this process,
I did. It
what
was when
was
oh, go ahead.
no? What was the? Why did you want to do that?
Basically, it was a practical decision. I was transitioning off the ambulance. I'd done it for 10 years, basically. And I did a little bit in college, and then I got to New York and did it for 9. And yeah, I was like, I love this job. I'm not going to do it my whole life. It was always the idea was to be kind of a springboard and to hold me down, while I moved into the creative realm, which I still didn't know what it was for a long time. So I got to a point where I was like, all right, I'm not going to renew my license. I'm going to transition into writing. I had a couple good like deals on the table, moderate, not good deals. Like they were nice for a starting out writer. They felt nice, but we're talking like a couple grand here and there, like not like living money. But
Mhm.
it felt like, okay, this is a career that is starting to take shape in front of me. And it's one that increasingly I can't sustain while I'm working full time. So what's that going to be? What's that going to mean? And I didn't want to just like jump off a cliff. I wanted to have some other mechanism. So, and I've always loved teaching. So I was like, all right, let me teach, and get an MFA will help me to do that. And I will learn a lot about writing in that process. So I made a very practical decision to get the MFA and do it in a low residency program. I did mine at Antioch, which was great. Like I had a great time, learned a lot, met cool people. I can't promise you that my degree helped me get teaching jobs. I got teaching jobs probably more because of Shadow Shaper than because of that degree, and the books that I
Mhm.
had done. But that doesn't mean that it wouldn't have. I do think like I guess my point is it's a practical decision, and it should always be a practical decision. One, because it's incredibly expensive. Two, because um, there's a lot of like sense people act like you're not a writer until you have a degree, and that's BS. Like it's nonsense. And I was already publishing at that point. So like what turned the corner? You're a writer because you write. That's it. So if I think it helped me. I enjoyed it. But like I treat it like a Capricorn.
So, you said that your idea of success is basically the same as it was before, like write what you want to write, be able to pay your bills, make a living at it. And doing that, how does things like New York Times bestsellers and awards fold into that? Like,
Yeah,
were
yeah.
those goals or yeah?
That's a great question. Because I think like we need to ask ourselves, and my current agent, Joanna Volpe, is really good at kind of like asking the deeper questions, like why do you want the things that you want? And that matters in part because a lot of those things are just not up to you. You can't
Mm-hmm.
decide to become a New York Times bestselling author. That's mostly up to the publisher. A lot of these things fall on us, including our sales in general. You can't decide to win awards. You just have to write the best book you can, and other people make those decisions. So when you're figuring out your goals, like it's really important to have an understanding of like, what do you really want? What's like the note behind the note, right? Like what's the goal behind the goal? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't, it's nice to have New York Times bestselling author in front of my name. Why? Not because it's a pretty group of words. And honestly, right now, I feel, can we swear on this?
Yeah.
I feel like fuck the New York Times right now. That's what I feel right now, honestly, because of their coverage of Gaza. Like it's outrageous, and I don't want anything to do with them. So I'm even here, like, man, all that work to get New York Times in front of my name, and I hate those words put together because they symbolize, genocide apologism.
Mm-hmm.
But that said, they do open doors too,
Mm-hmm.
and especially before all of this, like they that means something to certain people. And even if it doesn't mean something to me, those doors opening matter to me because they matter to my career. And so here we are, like, what do you do with that? Having certain awards means things. It can bring in more sales. Like, all the importance of those things mean something. Like the name itself, the words themselves, they mean things too, but maybe less than we give them, than the emphasis we give them. Right. So if it comes back, if my goal is write the work I want to write and live well from it, then everything else can filter into that goal. So like if being a New York Times bestselling author plays into that, cool, but are there other things that could help me more? Yeah. Like what they might be will force me to be creative and figure that out. Um, and I just think like that's the best way to understand it. Otherwise, what you do is run in circles trying to get things for the purpose of names, not realizing that like some other avenue might be much better for you, much healthier for you, and get you there faster. But because there's this
Mm-hmm.
emphasis that like writing puts on like this particular list, which is by the way extremely secretive, extremely corrupt. Well, we don't know if it's corrupt, but we know that it's chaotic. That people twice now in my career, I've had the numbers to be number 3 or number 4 on that list and not been on that list.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean? What do we do with that? So it's not a sign
Mm-hmm.
of good writing because there's terrible books on that list. It's not even a sign of good sales because there's books that sell way better than that list that don't appear on that list. So what does it mean? It's very arbitrary.
Right.
And I hate to see writers drive themselves, run themselves into the ground over something so arbitrary. It sucks.
Right. Yeah. And it's like you said, it opens doors. So are the letters, is the words in front of your name the goal, or the doors that it opens the goal?
Exactly.
And
The doors
yeah,
opening is the goal. Well, what's
right.
behind the doors is really the goal, right?
What's behind
So
the
you're
doors?
either
Yeah.
going to kick the door in or someone's going to open it for you. However you get through the door is actually another conversation. But the access that, then not the access, but the ability to then create whatever's behind that door or do the work with those resources.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of how it brings up the question too. Like, are you trying to boost a book or are you trying to boost a career? Right. Your publisher is
Yeah.
trying to boost a book. Like that's their job. But they often, more often than not, publishers don't really care about your career because that's not their job. That's your agent's
Mm-hmm.
job. It's your job. But publishers, unless they're like, we're going to build up this author and they design a program to do that. And even then, sometimes they're really just, it's the books, right? But you have to build you.
Yeah.
And if you rely on a publisher to do your job, you're in trouble. On the other hand, it's actually not your job. This is like going into the weeds, but it's not your job. It is the publisher's job to boost the book, right? And I think if we're honest, social media moves books in a way that could be compared, I think, to like making it in basketball. You know what I mean? Like a couple people do it out of thousands and thousands of millions, right? Like
Okay.
it's not a stable professional
Yeah.
decision to be like, I'm going to build up my social media and sell books that way, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
indie books or
Mm-hmm.
traditionally published books. Like, I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm saying you have to. It's not a guarantee. Nothing is a guarantee. But I think we have to look at it honestly. And like, TikTok moves books, but TikTok moves like very random books here and there.
Right.
Instagram moves books, but like, to stay relevant on Instagram, you have to post every, 2 hours, right? Like,
Like
that's
TikTok,
not to
yeah.
say, yeah, that's not to say don't do it. It's to say, like, we have to enter into it with an understanding of that. Otherwise, we will, again, like, drive ourselves into the ground doing the work that publishers are supposed to be doing and not even
Mhm.
seeing results from it. And that's a very quick way to burn out.
Right. And a lot of writers do burn out. And then things change, like Vine or things that don't exist anymore.
Right,
Like
right.
TikTok is here and
And
maybe it won't be in the future. Who
because they
knows?
just made it illegal. Like, it's right.
Right?
It's there. And that's your whole right? Like, Twitter was my platform for the
Yeah.
longest. I was on there for a long time. It works well with my brain for whatever reason,
Mhm.
and now with 55,000 followers, my posts don't get any traction because some, like, dirtbag billionaire picked it up and, like, jacked up the algorithm. I wasn't relying on Twitter to sell books. There was a time when I did very early on. I think it helped me a lot back when that was doable, but that changed, right? So, like, and
Mhm.
again, none of this is to say, I'm not trying to be discouraging. Like, I try to sell my books on social media. I'm saying, like, that can't be it. That
Right.
alone isn't going to do it. You have to be creative in lots of different ways to get that book out there, and especially when there is a publisher whose job it is to do that. Why aren't they doing it, and why are you running yourself into the ground?
Yeah. But a lot of us, I mean, depending on how much support you're getting, because you never know from book to book, contract to contract, there's so many reasons why your publisher may or may not be doing X, Y,
Exactly.
Z,
Totally.
and we're not in control of that. So then we feel like, oh, I have to do something. We don't
Exactly.
know what to do. We're
Right.
trying to do whatever we can,
Right.
and
No,
it's just that
definitely.
stress.
Exactly
Yeah.
that. And, like, I think the worst thing to feel is helpless. And
Yeah.
so we do what we can to not feel helpless. And I want to say again, like, we should be doing that. That's important.
Mhm.
What we shouldn't be doing is burning out to feel less helpless because we will actually be helpless when we burn out. And,
Right.
based on an algorithm that hates us and doesn't care about us and doesn't make
Mhm.
sense. It doesn't make sense, right? I think the only one that I would say, like, seems to be more really realistically helpful is something like a newsletter. um,
Mhm.
I haven't studied this deeply. I'm not a professional. My understanding is newsletters do move books, and, like, if you are consistent with it, there will be some payback into that. Whether or not you
Right.
can do it to the degree that you will, sell enough books that are really moving, like, for real, that's a full time job.
Yeah.
And that might be good for you, but be aware of that. That's all.
Mhm. Yeah. So, do you find yourself stair stepping your goals? Like, okay, I hit this, I got this advanced, or I sold this many books. Next time I'm going to do better. Next time I'm going to do more. Does that happen?
Not exactly. No, that doesn't feel familiar to me as a conversation I have, but I am very ambitious and I do always want to go to the next thing, but not, I guess, in terms of, I mean, and I do want, like, my sales to increase, like, for sure. I would say,
Mhm.
when I look back on my career, my sales have been just very, like, chaotic. Like, they're just very up and down. And that's pretty normal. The range is probably very extreme, I would say. Like, and maybe that's less normal. I don't really know. There's no way to know. But all that to say, I do always want to sell more books, and the reason I want to do that is so that I can keep, writing more books and, like, do the work I want to do and live well. Right now, I'm in an interesting moment where, more than at any other time in my career, I find myself, like, vastly overworked and
Mm,
wanting to figure out a way to still write, but work less and get paid more.
yeah.
Like, which is an interesting place to be in this far into my career. I think some of it is comics. I think some of it is, comics is just less lucrative in general,
Mhm.
and more
Mhm.
work. Because I write a monthly series, there's a lot behind it. I think also just capitalism is eating the world, and everything is more expensive, and this place is, like, less and less built for humans and more and
Right.
more built for, companies. And I had to really, like, remind myself of that as, like, just things around us change. It's just wild to, like, perceive that in a very direct way, in our wallets and our bank accounts. Like, it's not
Mhm.
just theory. Like, things are really spiraling in very, like, dangerous ways that just have nothing to do with humanity and everything to do with profit. And that sounds all like high-minded stuff, but the truth is, like, people suffer from that, and that's across the
Mhm.
board. And since COVID, especially, I think we've seen every industry just collapsing in different ways or spiraling and kind of spinning out of control in different ways. And publishing is no exception. Publishing has been a disaster since COVID started and continues to be, just in terms of, like, basic bureaucratic things, administrative things. payment, just everything. And then that contraction causes creative contraction too, because people
Mm-hmm.
acquiring books feel like they're on the line, because they are, and they become risk averse. We see it in
Yeah.
Hollywood, we see it
Yes.
across the board. So, how do we as artists survive that period? I don't know. I think that's a really good question. I know I've been as a turning point, I've been looking a lot more into things like, what does it look like to do comics in a more independent way, like whether it's Substack or self-publishing, on different sites, or just have my own site. I don't know the
Mm-hmm.
answer, but I know like that seems really appealing right now, whereas I've always been a traditional published person.
Right. And then all of this is upheaval. It affects us creatively. Do you find that your stories or what you're putting in your work is affected by this?
Definitely. I mean, I don't think you can ever say no to that question, because, the work we're making is just such a part of, it just comes from all the things we're taking in, we're putting it back out into the world. So on a basic level, I mean, I know that's vague, but on a basic level, yes. Um, but maybe you mean more sort of strategically. Like, I don't think I'm tailoring work differently because of it. I think the main result is like I have to put extra effort into like not letting the kind of crispy fringes of burnout that I feel in my own life get to the work. You
Okay.
know,
Yeah.
like, because I am working so hard, and just like, hitting deadlines and jumping to the next thing, which is not what I want. I would say that is not fulfilling the goal that I set out for myself.
Mm.
But
Hmm.
that's a good moment to say like, this shit is fluid. Like, that you don't make it and then it's over. You don't. That's not really how that works. Like, you make it and you set new goals, and then sometimes you
Right.
fall below your original goals, and then you have to figure out new ways to. But it's an ongoing conversation. It's not linear. And I think we
Hmm.
want to make it linear sometimes in our heads, because we live in the West, like we're very prone towards linear thinking, but it's very cyclical, circular, complex. It's more like a hurricane or a tornado than anything else. And that's beautiful,
Mm.
but only if you
Yeah.
embrace that truth. If you
Hmm.
try to fight it, it's going to hurt a lot more. All
Right.
that to say, I've been working really hard, and someone recently told me like, oh yeah, I told him that as an editor that I work with, and he was like, oh yeah, I had no idea, like the joy is still really present in your work, and the fun of it all is still really there. And I was so relieved, because I couldn't tell. Like, that's the worst part. I didn't have a gauge. I didn't think I was dropping the ball. I didn't think the work was like coming out bitter. I don't feel bitter, but like, I just didn't know, because I've been so busy. It's hard to
Yeah.
like. That's the danger of that constant busyness, is it's hard to like take a breath and like look over the work
Hmm.
at time. And that sucks. It shouldn't be that way. That's not a good artistic place to be in.
Right.
But it turns out I'm still killing it.
That is amazing. And it is hard. I found that the I have a book that comes out next week, and in the first
Oh,
draft of
congrats.
it, and it's dealing with Black history and some tough topics, but I'm my brand, I'm trying to be like Black joy, so like deal with Black history but also not bring you down. I don't want to be writing trauma or anything like that. And the first draft, my editor was like, Leslie, there was no joy in this book.
Oh shit.
And I was like, and I
Wow.
looked at it and I was like, you were right. And I had to
Woo.
rewrite like 70% of it. And it was
Whoa.
part of the things going on in my life that were really hard, and then the subject matter and trying to put these things together. But yeah, and I don't know if it was burnout. I don't know what it was, but there was a lot of things, coming. And I did a whole rewrite, and I injected joy like as much as I could amidst the pain. And so, yeah, that's something that is important, and to me personally, and like, what do I want to be writing? How do I make sure that everything else, whether it is whatever stressors are in my life, emotional, financial, whatever, are not are in the work, because
Right.
it's a
Right.
reflection of me, but not like in a way that I don't want it to be.
Exactly. Yeah. That's such a good note that she gave you. I love that she gave that to you, because I do think like, and I like dark, heavy shit, I think work, for me, work needs to look at history honestly, like to work, even if it's fantasy. But that lack of joy is a killer. Like, it's like you see, and it's not true. I think that's the thing about it. Like, besides
Yeah.
that it's just a drag to read, like there is joy in these moments. We have to be very intentional and strategic, especially with like true life horrors, like how we bring it in, right? Like,
Hmm.
I think about that picture book that caused a big fuss a bunch of years ago called "To Find Dessert," right? Where there was this scene. It was like a dessert throughout history, and there was one section of it that showed enslaved folks, and they were just having a great time, like picking stuff from the field and like making the dessert, and like it was really fucked up. And like it was made by two white women, and it was very much like it just you just look at it and you're like, this is like pro-slavery propaganda. Like they didn't think that when they wrote it, I'm sure, but it doesn't matter what they thought when they wrote it, right? They still
Right.
presented the world with these enslaved people having a great time, and like there's such a long
Yeah.
history of that image and what that means that they were totally checked out from.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had this, blow up, and then it became like, oh, cancel culture and how dare you and censorship and all this other garbage, just because people were saying like, it's not good to do this. Like showing enslaved people smiling is a problem, right? The whole thing with
Mm-hmm.
Frederick Douglass not smiling in photos, like
Mm-hmm.
this is a long conversation, and they were totally alienated from that. They had alienated themselves from that conversation, and I think their
Mm-hmm.
whiteness had done that. And so they weren't able to have it. And so they created this work that did that, and then it's like, you can't do that, but you also can't just do like beat people down all the time, right? So
Right.
how do you find that
And
balance? It's not
recognize,
balanced. Yeah,
yeah, that our ancestors did have moments of joy. They did have love. They did find joy in their circumstances. But it's like, yeah, who is telling the story and how are you framing it? Because a
right,
lot of, dealing with history is like, okay, yeah, it's not all gloom and doom because it couldn't have been because these are
right,
human beings. And no
exactly,
matter what, they're going to try to find that little piece of joy and love and resilience inside of all the horrible circumstances. So
totally,
that's
yeah.
important for us to see in the right context, you
Yeah,
know?
and I think along with that, sort of like figuring out how folks were active participants, whereas like so much of history, especially history of people of color, like just turns everyone into just these people who are either saved or murdered, like saved
Yeah.
or murdered, and
Yeah.
that's it, pop, pop, pop. Like who takes initiative, who gets to act, who gets to be a hero. And when you actually look at history, like obviously, like so many people of color did so many amazing things and like changed the world and
Right.
like fought back and organized and all this stuff, and like, but that's gone, or it's like
Mhm.
the singular narrative of the one person who like got tired and sat down
Right.
on a bus, right? Like that's not how any of the shit works, and they know that, but it's much more convenient to individualize things and to just kind of like sweep it all into this like whatever. People don't want to talk about movement building,
Mhm.
about like true activism, like and the fact that that's not how that even happened. All these layers of it that are just lost, and those stories are so much more interesting, like the real,
Mhm.
and like
Yeah.
they're so much more ripe for fiction, for
Yes.
history telling, so it's like it's a double crime that they're erased, because you're erasing the actual history and you're like telling a more bland story on top of that. Why?
Mhm.
We know why.
Yeah. Right. So, what does it mean to you to write with authenticity, especially with your activism background?
Oh man, what a question. I have no idea how to answer that. It's a great question. I don't know, like authenticity. Do you have an answer for that?
I think when I think about writing with authenticity, it's coming like being hybrid and doing self-publishing and
Mhm.
traditional publishing. In the self-publishing world, it's a lot about writing to market. And which means looking at what's selling, look at what people like about what's selling, reading reviews, and really tailoring it to the audience to the point where many authors will do what the audience wants. If the audience has a in the reviews are saying something like, oh, in book 2 they should do this, they will write that thing. And that's one way to run your career. Like for me, the reasons why I started writing in the first place is because I had something to say. And so for
Mhm.
me, writing with authenticity is like balancing it. Like we are in a commercial endeavor. We are trying to sell books to people. So we want to have them be like commercially viable. But also, one of the most important things to me, like one of my goals or success goals is to have an impact
Mm.
and to have an
Right.
impact on readers.
Oh,
And so
totally.
authenticity is telling the stories that I think will have an impact that will entertain and will be commercially viable. But like that's not necessarily my primary thing, which might be a mistake in the marketplace. We talk about capitalism is trying to eat us all, but like
Yeah,
I
yeah.
can't do this if I'm only just writing exactly what readers say that they want.
No,
You know what I mean?
100%. I think that's a great way to frame it, and that kind of reminds me that there was, I think, you could put it like it was like a caveat when I mean, and one that I was very conscious of back when I was first kind of designing that goal, right? Like thinking about
Mm-hmm.
what success would mean. when I was like the books that I want to write, what I knew within that, I guess it was like unspoken in that part of it, but was very true is what you said. Like I want books that will change the world, that will lift up, my people and the people that I love and care about in a broad way, like that people will see themselves in who don't get to see
Yes.
themselves in books. Like all those were kind of part of my plan, but they all slid under the realm of like what I want to write, right? Because to come back to an earlier point, like I've won awards and they're cool and all, but there's nothing like someone coming up to you and being like, I saw myself in your book for the first time, and I
Mm-hmm.
never seen myself in a book, right? Like that changes your life. You change their life.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're going to go on and write books or do something else great in part because of that, not entirely, but in part because of that, those things truly matter, like so much more than a bestseller list. Like they matter so much. So every time that's happened to me, whether it's an email or in person or whatever, or TikTok, like that's like such a great reminder of like what it really means to do this work. To that end, like to answer your question, like what, those are benchmarks. Like there's people out there, whose opinions I really value, and they don't write for the New York Times. Like, they don't write at all, maybe. Like they're just the kids that I'm writing for or the adults that I'm writing for. And when you hit that, you did your job, and like that's where I think authenticity lives. I think it's a really great and really tricky question for fiction writers, because we all, like, by nature of the work, you have to jump into other people's heads. You
Mm-hmm.
have to jump into other people's bodies. It's part of
Mm-hmm.
the work, and you fail if you don't do that. And there's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of ways to fail if you do that. So you have to do it with a consciousness and an understanding, and I think a certain respect and responsibility that a lot of people want to gloss over and
Mm-hmm.
accuse us of having a conversation that's more about telling people what to do or something. Like I'm not interested in telling anybody what to do. You do what you do. You know what I mean? But understand that the work you put out into the world matters. Like
Mm-hmm.
it can hurt people. It can affect people. If you believe in the power of words to save people, you have to understand too that it can also damage people. And that's, people don't want to hear that because, oh no, the sacred literature, like it could never do no wrong. But literature has done wrong for centuries. It has been damaging and dangerous to people for centuries, not in the sense of the way that like the far right, uses that now to talk about book bans, but in the sense of negative stereotypes, of people. And like, this is where it gets so tricky. But I think that the danger of that convolutedness increases the need to have this conversation in a real way. I think there's a group of people in the middle, and I'm looking directly at like Pen America, and like the sort of like the group that only wants to talk about free speech but not deal with race or power dynamics or the way that literature can actually, hurt. And they want to make it a wash, like, oh, these people want to censor and these people want to have like more nuanced conversations about representation, so they're all the same, so that's just
Mm-hmm.
bad. We're going to put that in a corner over here and call it bad, and then we're going to go on with our like whatever happy liberal lives. And it's more complicated than that. And we
Mm-hmm.
have to acknowledge that because it's true. Like, but I just, I really question anyone who wants to just like throw it all into a bag like that and make the conversation so deeply unnuanced that I think it suits them and their version of reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, writing with empathy is a thing that is important, especially as we have to write with multiple perspectives. You mentioned like responsibility is important. Fiction creates empathy, which is one of the most powerful things, one of the reasons why I think it can have an impact. So
Yeah.
I imagine, like someone asked me once about like, oh, how do you avoid writing for the white gaze? And it's never come across my mind to write for the white gaze. Like
Right.
I'm writing these stories, but no matter what perspective I'm writing from, I'm trying to do it with empathy so that hopefully it creates empathy in the people who read it for
Totally.
these characters and for people whose experiences might not match their own.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a conversation we all have to have with ourselves, even if it's to be like, oh yeah, I would never do that, like, or it
Yeah.
wouldn't even occur to me. I know for myself, like, being a non-Black Latino, and in the swirl of power dynamics that encompasses, is really important for me to just check all of that stuff really consistently, and also have a sense of accountability. Like we talk about accountability a lot in community organizations and activist work and stuff like that, and the idea of But I think particularly as we're folks who are trying to move away from the nonprofit model, having accountability to people and to stories instead of to numbers and to,
Mm-hmm.
grants. But as writers, we have to have accountability too, and the structure of being a writer professionally creates an automatic accountability dynamic where you're accountable to your agent and your editor and the publishers in certain ways because they're the ones giving you notes and to your contract. Ultimately, you have a contract,
Right.
right? But who are your people? Like who are the people
Yeah.
that who are your first readers? Who are the people that you're writing about? Are you accountable to them? Like, do you have
Mm-hmm.
conversations with them? Do they get to read drafts before it goes to press? You know what I mean? And
Mm-hmm.
there's no way to do that without some level of tokenization. So like the conversation is always difficult and complex, but that doesn't mean don't do it, right? It's the same with like the
Right.
censorship thing. Like it's not a wash just because it is really challenging to get through all of these kind of layers of power that are going on. But
Mm-hmm.
like you have to do it. You have to have some understanding of like what that looks like. What's an accountability structure for a writer? And there isn't one answer. There isn't a clear answer, and people hate that too. But that's a good thing in a way because it forces us to challenge ourselves to be creative with how we approach the question.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, all of these things require nuance, which is so hard to do on social media, and so many conversations are done without nuance when yeah, it's all layered and complicated. So, yeah, at this point in your career, with the success level that you've had, what keeps you going? Kind of talked about this a little bit, but, like, especially in dealing with burnout,
Hmm.
aside from, okay, this is what pays your bills, but I'm sure you could potentially find some other job. Maybe not. I mean, that'd be interesting. What keeps you going? What keeps you still writing
I
today?
love the challenge of something new. I really love like getting into comics was this really new thing that also felt really familiar and true to my visual nature. I've always been a comic book fan, but writing it was like learning a new language, but one that I had heard a lot as a kid, I guess is the best way to think of it. So that, just that felt like it really lit me up at a point in my career when I wasn't feeling burnt out so much as I think I was just searching for like, okay, new ways to challenge myself, new directions to take my craft, new ways to understand story and storytelling. So that has just been really exciting. And now, having done that for a couple of years, I don't want to stop at all, but I also want to see now returning to prose. How am I a different prose writer because of that experience of
Mm,
writing so much comics? And then also just, where can I go next with my prose? Like what new kinds of stories can I tell? I think too, like, just given the state of the world, it's a really tricky challenge to figure out how to respond to that as an artist.
mhm,
I just ask myself that every day, I guess, just watching a genocide unroll. And yeah, in some ways it's a very dark question because there's days where it's hard to feel like the work matters at all
mhm.
when bombs are falling on tents.
Right.
And there's other days or moments when it seems like the most important thing in the world is like to be able to express, all those levels of grief and rage, and hope and
Mhm,
despair that are happening. It's like I know that's when we need artists. This moment is when we need artists. This moment is when we need a lot of things, though. It's not just artists, and
right.
it's I've also needed to for myself as much as for what I think the importance of it in the world. I've really needed to be out in the street, with a sign and doing the
Mhm,
organizing work behind that work too, because I personally wouldn't feel like a whole person if I wasn't doing that work in the
mhm.
considering what's happening in this moment.
Right.
And that has also contributed to me not having enough time in my life to finish my work. You know what I mean? Like,
Okay.
but I
Yeah.
wouldn't be able to finish my work if I wasn't doing that. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
those are just
Mhm.
the things I know about myself. That's different for everybody. I'm not trying to be prescriptive. I know what I need to do. And
Right.
organizing and activism take on a lot of different, like they look different. Like there
Yeah.
isn't one right way, right? So there's that. But yeah, I mean, all that said, like I think it's like we're constantly being asked to rise to the challenge if we're paying attention, and that's
Mhm,
a hard thing, but that's a good thing. I know for myself, like I don't. That's the only way to exist.
mhm. Yeah. And the artist as, like, an integrated person, so knowing what you need to do to create and realizing that creating that the art is healing,
Right.
It
Exactly.
might not
Yeah,
be
totally.
in the hearts and minds of
Mhm.
people who can then go on and do more things and paying it
Exactly.
forward. So
Right.
yeah, it's deeply connected.
Mhm.
Do you have imposter syndrome at all as a
Sometimes,
writer?
yeah. I do. It just hits in weird moments, like, honestly, I think when I start to track it, it's usually connected most to exhaustion
Mm,
than anything else. Like, because it's not real, like, by definition, imposter syndrome is like a fallacy, right? Like you're thinking things that are not true, right? Like that's
yeah.
because otherwise it would just be like self-awareness syndrome, right? Like, but no, it's not. There's people that need that, right? Like
Yes, that's a different syndrome.
I would
Yeah.
love to reassign imposter syndrome to people that deserve it, but then it wouldn't be imposter syndrome; it would just be true. But when we're talking about imposter syndrome, like we're talking about your brain telling you something that is factually incorrect, which is that you don't
Hmm.
belong or deserve to be here. I know that that's not true about myself. I know it less. I know it's not true, but I know it's not true way less, or I'm much less able to kind of point out how untrue it is to my own brain when I'm run down, when I'm burnt out, when I'm overworked, when I can't catch a moment to like pause and unwind. Like those are those moments when that happens. And, especially being a father, that does happen a lot, right? Like I love my
Right.
son. It's no lack of love. It's like surely like that's having, let me say a parent. Like it's really like having like several full-time jobs, right?
Hmm.
And so, and dogs. And so, like, that happens. And then for me, it's been recently about really being able to recognize that, though. And in a way, it becomes a blessing because you're like, wait a minute. Like, when that voice comes and it's like, what are you doing? Like, you can't do this. Or like, you don't deserve that. Why did you get that? It does happen for sure. And a lot of times I've kind of trained my brain to be like, oh, whoa, whoa, whoa. That's bullshit. Like, step back, what did you miss? Was it a cup of
Mm,
coffee today? Like, was it a nap? Like, what's really going on? And I'm not trying to trivialize it. Like, it's very serious. And it's not always that, but I do think like we burn out and part of a function of burnout is letting those negative voices in. Like we don't have
mm,
defenses against them. And so they just rush in so much more, which again is not to say there aren't like real things beneath those voices that are like, need to be undone. But I do think that's part of it.
yeah. Yeah. I think very few writers, although I've talked to some who do not have imposter syndrome, but it's
Mm.
something that is so common. And I think the idea that when you're tired, it's like when you're at your worst, you can believe those things that aren't true. When you're
Yeah,
full of energy and you're at your best and you've been pumped up, it's
right,
harder for that to penetrate, right?
right. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it'll hit in weird ways. I think envy is another conversation we have to just always have as writers because you'll do
Yes.
something and you'll just be like, why did they get that? And then you'll be like, because they're better than me. And then it's like, wait. Like, hold on. Or it'll be like, because they, whatever, you just make up stories. You make up
Hmm.
stories. That's your job as a writer. However, you got to keep it on the page. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
that's but I mean, I think it's just really important to check. And like with fear, right? Like I try, doesn't mean I succeed, but when I feel fear rise up, whether it's existential or about the world or about very real threats around me, whatever, I just think it can be so like it can confuse you, right? It can just create so much chaos around you and in your thought process, right? And like
Hmm.
if we pause and if we look fear in the eye, we learn so much. Like fear is actually a great teacher, and it
Hmm.
really reveals things. Especially because usually when we work through it, there's something else underneath that's even more important. It has
Yeah.
something even more worthwhile to say to us, but we've been avoiding. And fear, as much as fear sucks, sometimes it's easier to deal with than grief, or
Mm, yeah.
regret, like different things that also suck.
Shame. Yeah.
Shame, right? Like all these things that are even worse or feel worse that we don't want to look at. And it's like sometimes you have to take that mask of fear off and look more deeply at what's behind it. And then suddenly it's like not even about fear anymore. It's about something else that you have to deal with too. And I'm not saying that's easy. I just know, we can't walk around in this heightened state of like of fear, and sometimes we do anyway. But I think
Hmm.
like the more that we can work against that, and I don't want to make it sound like you can just flip a switch because it's not that.
Right.
But I think there are moments sometimes where we are able to pause, and when we can do that, the world changes.
Right. Yeah. So, what advice would you give to an author starting out, first couple contracts, about the relationship with success and how to set their goals in this career?
Oh yeah, great question. I mean, my wife and I talk about this a lot because she's a writer and a newer
Yes.
writer. In fact, wait, let me plug our podcast. It's called
Yeah.
Inkbottle. I always forget to talk about it. We are due for an episode, but we talk about parenting and writing and exactly these type of things a lot on the podcast. So we talk about that. She's in the middle of her first series, which is called the Forge and Fracture Saga, and it's amazing. It's a historical fantasy, Shakespeare in England, the Fae, Orisha. It's amazing.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah, the first book is called That Self-Same Metal. But all that to say, we work through these questions, and it's interesting, me being 20 books deep and her being 2 books deep, and how much the world is different now from when I was starting out and all that. Not to sound old, but it's been 10 years for me too, more. And yeah, but I think like the first thing is what we've been talking about this whole time, which is why this conversation is so important. I love that you're having it, is to like really define that question for yourself. Like, what is success? What's it going to look like? What's a sustainable conversation about success? Because it's not one book. And I think we're very prone to like publishing functions and like this book, this is the thing, the book, right?
Yeah.
And if that book doesn't hit the list, or if that book doesn't explode, then it's just a what, it's a this. Like there's this binary understanding too. Like, book is a hit, this book is not a hit. Shadow Shipper didn't hit the list until 6 months after it came out. And that book has long ass legs. Like that book has been carrying the weight of so many sales for many, many, many years now. Continues to get me speaking gigs. That book came out in 2016, 2015, right?
Okay.
Yeah. We're coming up on 10 years of Shadow Shaper next year. Yeah. And people are still randomly reaching out and being like, Shadow Shaper, and like, that's so much more important than if it had been like, hit the list and sold a million copies off the bat and then just buttered out, which is a very common thing to happen, right? So like, just having that, and that's not to say one is better or worse. I'm just saying like, that's what that book needed to do. And it did it. And that's a different dynamic than what we usually are told is like, it's like that doesn't fit into the hit or flop kind of dynamic, right?
Yeah.
So like approach it with a nuanced understanding, because it's just like there's long game involved that's very hard to wrap our heads around as newer writers. And even as like established writers, it's hard to wrap our heads around it. Find people in the industry that you trust and work with them, but don't be afraid to leave people that you don't trust. Like if it's not working, like, and sometimes you have to make really hard career moves that feel like the end of everything. But the truth is sometimes inertia is the end of everything. Like it just feels easier. So we kind of go with it. I left an agent before I had published any books, like, before I'd even published, like when I had just signed the contract for that very small indie press, and I had an agent for like a couple months, and I walked away from her, knowing that like I may never get another one. And I didn't. It took me another year to get another agent, but it was a very happy year in terms of like thinking about my career, because no agent is absolutely better than even a mediocre agent.
Yeah.
And that's hard. Like I can't count the number of writers who I've sort of like talked down from the cliff of being like, I could never fire my agent, to being like, yeah, my agent is not good for me. Like I need to leave like now. Like, that's a hard conversation to have. And I've had it a lot because writers, we don't want to, because it's scary. Like it's scary, you feel like you're burning a bridge, right? And like sometimes agents will act like you are. That's a whole other conversation. The point is, I think we need to be as creative with our careers as we are with our books. Treat our careers as something that if we activate our creative minds when we think about our careers, whether that's in the realm of marketing, of putting ourselves out there, like we were talking about social media. Like when I know for myself, like the more creatively I think about social media, the better I am at it. Whether or not things like go viral or not, like if you're enjoying it because you're doing the thing that you love doing, which is being an artist and being creative, being a storyteller, you'll do it more and you'll do it better and you'll keep doing it, right? That's what matters. Or whether it's finding an agent or all these different career questions, like those are strategy questions. They're complex. There's a lot of parts of our brain we have to use, but that's all creativity.
Yeah.
Like the same muscle that we think through, like problems in our books, like power dynamics and world building, like that's the same muscle, and It just feels more heightened because it is our actual bank accounts that will suffer when we do the wrong thing. It is our actual like lives that are affected by it. And then finally to recognize what we said early on, which is that like there are a lot of things in this career, and it seems almost singular in this. It's not, but it feels like it, that have nothing to do with us. They're not personal, they're not whatever, and like, but they're not decisions that we make. We don't make the most of the decisions that decide whether or not our book is going to fail or succeed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a binary, but like how our book does, like those decisions aren't ours. Like that's hard to like, because we reap the harvest of them for better or for worse. Like people look at us because of them differently. People, pay us differently because of them.
Mm-hmm.
They affect us like more than anything else, but all we're in charge of is writing the book and then marketing the book to the best of our abilities. Right. Like, so all of that, which means I try to think of it as like the same way I think about when I was a paramedic. Like you have a person in cardiac arrest, you don't go in there being like, I'm going to save this person. Not because you're trying to be like realistic. It's not about being realistic. It's just about like, or maybe it's about real. You're not trying to be pessimistic, right? Like most people in cardiac arrest don't come back. It's not like on TV. You don't just go in there and do a quick couple rounds of CPR, shock them one time, and they pop up and start walking around and shooting bad guys. Like that's not how it works. Okay. And if you're a paramedic, you know that. So you go into a cardiac arrest being like, I'm going to do my job, which is to do CPR, run this arrest the right way, give them the medication they need, shock them if they need it, start the IV, all that's intubate, blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to take them to the hospital. And it's truly, I'm giving it to God. Like I am not in charge of this person's life or death. I'm in charge of doing all the earthly human things that I can do to keep them alive and to bring them back if that's possible. And then the rest of it is up to God. And then it's up to the doctors when I drop them off. That's it. Your job as the writer is to write the book. And then when your book is out in the world, your job is to do your damnedest to sell it, without burning out. Right. Like, but you have to know that so that you're not trying to do everyone else's job.
Right.
Getting in their way, making them do a worse job because you're constantly, whatever, all that stuff, there's just levels to it. So I think it's like clarity around what your role is, what your job is, what your limits are. Mm-hmm. And then, always coming back to the core of this work, which is storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate talking to you and appreciate your time and all of your insights and wisdom.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to talk to you.
Daniel and I both have a decade plus in this industry, and looking back on where we've been and where we want to go while protecting ourselves from burnout is vital. Crafting a creative career that can support you, allow you to express yourself, and leave a lasting and meaningful impact on the world is not an easy thing to do, especially in an industry where so much of what we term success and failure are due to things entirely beyond our control. But persevering when times are difficult is as much about being driven by purpose as it is about hearing from readers whose lives you've touched. If you'd like to learn more about Daniel José Older and his work, including his novels, comics, and podcast, I have links in the show notes. And please sign up for the Footnotes newsletter, which includes the show notes for each episode, as well as inspiration, strategies, and ideas to help you grow as a writer. That's at myimaginaryfriends.net/footnotes. When you sign up, you can choose to become an imaginary best friend for a few dollars a month and get access to premium posts, quarterly workshops, as well as discounts on my courses and coaching. And until the next time, keep imagining.